Today's lesson is dealing with energy, and energy is produced naturally by living things. And so, what we want to focus on is energy that's produced by the green stuff, the plants, and how that energy is transferred into other organisms. Some of those organisms we're not realizing the energy transformations, but we'll take a look at that. All right. So the first term that we use to describe this energy pyramid of and transformation is producers, oftentimes referred to as autotrophs. And producers or autotrophs have a ability to make their own food. In other words, they have their ability to make their own energy. They don't necessarily eat like we traditionally think so, and these are traditionally known as plants, the green things, and they use a method called photosynthesis. And you may recall photosynthesis that occurs in plants, specifically in a region of the plant that takes the photons or energy from the sun and converts it into a product. That's photosynthesis. Now, there are some bacteria that can also make their own energy, and they use a means called chemiosynthesis. And that is, they're making their energy from the environment. So, if you, for example, go to those thermal hotbeds in Yellowstone, you'll notice the dramatic colors that are occurring in those small little pools of water from the thermal vents. Those colors are actually bacteria, and a variety of different bacteria that are able to survive in those conditions. And those are a good example of organisms that can make their own energy in some real hostile environments, for example, within those thermal hotbeds. All right. Well, since we're talking about plants, one of the things that plants do really well is make energy, but they can't do that without water. And so, what I have here is a diagram of the tube network that goes from the roots all the way to the leaves. And this tube network is referred to as the xylem and the phloem. And so, as water is carried from the roots to these photosynthesizing elements of the leaf, they're carried to that area in a region called the xylem, and that's XYLEM. And the xylem has the capacity to carry drop by drop of water from those roots that they're collecting water from to the tops of the plants, whether that's the giant redwoods or just a simple vascular plant that you can find like a flower. So the idea of these tubes is to transport water from the soil up to the leaves. Now, once that happens and energy is produced in these leaves, then there's another network of tubes that you can see in purple there that have the ability to transport the products, in this case, sugar, from the leaves to areas of the plant where it can be stored, typically within the bark or the trunks of the trees. They call that the vascular tissue, and that is the term the phloem. So we have water carrying up to the leaves and tubes that are called the xylem, and the tubes that carry the sugars from the leaves to the other areas of the plant, and that's the phloem. So when we're looking at this, then water is going to be have a really important role in the production of these photosynthesizing plants, these energy producers. So on the graph there, you can see some ecosystems, some just different areas that have the ability to grow things, some with very little water that you can see in the desert, versus on the far right where you have the tropical rainforest where there's plenty, or in the estuary where there's plenty of water. And what you'll notice is that on the left side where it says the average primary productivity goes from 0 all the way to 2,000. So obviously the areas like in Minnesota where we have a temperate grassland and lakes, and to some degree some savannas like areas, the productivity is pretty high, but not as high as the tropical rainforest or not as low as the desert. So we're kind of in between here in Minnesota in the heartland. So how much photosynthesis is occurring is what this is demonstrating. And my lights just went out, so I'm going to wave. There we go. And so how much photosynthesis or chemiosmosis is occurring chemosynthesis is occurring is what you're seeing here. So which ecosystem has the greatest net productivity? As you can see, it's on the far right with those tropical and estuary systems, and the deserts from the desert southwest is the lowest. Now, if we move away from those primary producers, those autotrophs, the next major group is referred to as the consumers, those that are consuming the energy produced by these green plants. And another term that is used to describe this group are referred to as the heterotrophs. Now, you might remember these heterotrophs as the lions and tigers and bears. In other words, those that eat the producers. In other words, those are, like, for example, the zebras, those that eat other consumers, and those that produce or eat both producers and consumers. Obviously, the zebra is the herbivore. We have the carnivores with the lion, and of course, the omnivores with the big old brown bear or grizzly bear. So the herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores, those are terms that you probably remember from earlier days, and we're just reemphasizing. The most important piece here is that they're all considered to be consumers or heterotrophs. They're obtaining their energy by eating others. So really the last group, so we have the those that produce energy, those that consume it, and then another group called the detrivores actually help recycle the organic mass. So if we look at these, these are the organisms that recycle the dead stuff, these detrivores, and they're necessary in an ecosystem. Like for example, we have this big vulture here, and we have some vultures in Minnesota down by Red Wing and Winona. If you ever seen those turkey vultures, they're have a similar appearance. They're a little different colors, but they all have bald heads. And one of the trivia questions that is typically asked is, why is that? Why do they have a bald head and absence of feathers? Well, it probably has something to do with most of these vultures living in the desert areas where heat and the way that they manage the heat is really important. For example, if you put a hat on, you know that your heat is going to be retained differently than without a hat. Same thing here with the these detrivores like the vultures. Without the absence of some of those items or those feathers, they can radiate off that heat a little bit easier, potentially, along with some other potential possibilities here that we can look at later. And then, so we have these detrivores and then these decomposers. Now, the decomposers we oftentimes talk about. This is our fungi or bacteria. It's kind of a subclass of the detrivores, and they have the ability to break down tissues or living material into simpler molecules, the simple molecules of life, and have the ability to return that back into the soil for obviously the autotrophs to reutilize and use again for their material needs as well. So, in a sense, it's the circle of life where the decomposers are bringing things back so that others, the new cells and new organisms, can take advantage of the waste and the decomposition of the former living organisms. Um, One of the areas that we do spend some time with is the energy pyramids. And if you look at this simple diagram here, where you have the producers at number one, where you obviously have some green plants, trees, grasses. Number two, where you have some organisms like the zebras that you can find on the savannas. And then number three, where the focus is the lions and maybe the cheetahs. So there are three levels there. We'll start at the bottom first. This is what we're looking at, how energy is transferred from the bottom up. And what you'll notice here, this is probably an energy level of looking at producers to consumers, and just the types of organisms. And so if we look at just the sheer numbers, we can call that a numbers pyramid. And what we'll see on this particular diagram is that as you go from the producers, which we might have billions and billions and billions of producers, and as you move up the pyramid, the numbers, the sheer numbers of those consumers decreases. So each level here is referred to as a trophic level then. So as you go from level 1 to 2 to 3, we're going from one trophic level to the next to the third. The third trophic level being that on the top. All right. So then organisms that produce at these trophic levels for the levels of food are referred to as these producers. And these producers have the ability to photosynthesize and transfer their energy onto those next levels, those consumers. So the second trophic level is oftentimes referred to as the primary consumers. In other words, those are the first ones that eat the plants. The ones above that are oftentimes referred to as just in blanket, kind of the secondary consumers. So you have the producers, primary consumers, and secondary consumers. And this is a good example that we can kind of summarize all of those on one particular graphic model there. Anything above the secondary consumers, the third level, are referred to as the tertiary consumers. And there aren't that many examples of this, but again, we'll consider that level and above is the tertiary, the top order consumers. So if we were to pull all these together and show the relationships, and again, notice down the bottom here where you have A is to B with the arrow going from A to B, the arrows indicate the movement of energy from A to B or from one organism to the next. So in this case, this is referred to as a food web. And a food web is showing you all the intricacies of an ecosystem and how they're all related and how where the energy is going from one organism to another. An organism might have several food sources, so therefore there could be several arrows going to and from a particular organism, whether it's a primary consumer or a secondary consumer. If we're looking at just one chain or one just pathway of that, this is referred to as a food chain. It's the path of the feeding relationships that is from one to another to a third to maybe a fourth. If we have several of those, that's the difference. In other words, several food chains would develop into what we call a food web. So several food chains develop into a food web. I'm going to skip this. So, one of the things that we like to look at, and there are several types of pyramids. One of the ones we looked at earlier was a numbers pyramid, just the sheer numbers of organisms, is that roughly 10% of the energy level at the bottom is usable or transferred to the next level. So, if we're looking at producers there in red, only 10% of the energy is going to be transferred to the herbivores there in orange. And it's referred to as the 10% rule. Now, it might be 14 or 15% from the producers to the herbivores, and then maybe it could get down to maybe, let's say, 8% from the herbivores to the small carnivores, and even a smaller percent from the small carnivores to the carnivores. But on average, and that's what we're looking at here, the average is about 10% going from one level to the next. And so much of the energy that is produced then is going to heat and other ways to for energy transformations within the organism. But for example, in humans, a lot of our energy is lost as heat. So the energy that we take in is used to for those homeostatic balances that we need that are necessary to cool the body down or heat up the body. We are dependent upon that energy to help and regulate our body temperature. But again, the 10% rule is something oftentimes talked about. And one of the reasons why large carnivores that are the tertiary consumers, that they are in such small numbers is because really when you think about it, only 10% is of the energy that's total produced in the ecosystem is going to be available to those top tier consumers. So example of that is if you go to the Serengeti, there might be 1,000 of these zebras, gazelles, and wildebeests all within a particular area. And for every 1,000 organisms like that, these primary consumers, there might be just one lion or leopard that would support this particular ecosystem. So again, that energy level is much different for those top order carnivores. So there just isn't enough energy available to them. So if we really think about it, if we wanted to use our food supplies in the most efficient way, should humans be carnivores, herbivores, or omnivores? Really, the simple answer is we should be herbivores. if we think about this, like cows and other livestock, they produce a lot of waste. A lot of the energy that we're getting from that food, we give them, and they're producing waste products and producing a lot of heat. So all the water and other things that are now going to be affected and polluted as a result of that in the environment are very numerous. So that's one little take on energy transformation, some of the terminologies and the use of the pyramids and how we can look at pyramids, whether that be periods of biomass that's mentioned, a period of energy, or a pyramid of numbers. And oftentimes we think about energy being transferred with pyramid of numbers as the examples that I gave you.